Okay, great. Well, thank you everyone for being here. So this is Dr. Jamie Chavez, and my name is Cheryl Breyer. I'm an executive assistant at IEA. Thank you all for joining us at our Gifted Support Group meeting. If you haven't been to one before, it really is an opportunity to bring gifted educators and presenters on a specific topic to talk about. And it's really geared for our parents and educators. So we'll have a Q&A session after the presentation, but I did want to talk a little bit about Jamie, so I'll give a little background if you don't mind. So Jamie attended undergrad at Bradley University with degrees in health science and psychology. She earned her doctorate in occupational therapy at Washington University in St. Louis School of Medicine, and much of her 12-year career as an occupational therapist has been rooted in sensory integration theory and practice. Learning is truly one of her passions, and she understands that collaborating with an integrated team is the key to holistic care. And in 2020 and 2021, she co-authored the books, The Why Behind Classroom Behaviors and Creating Sensory Smart Classrooms, in order to support and equip educators who have students with various learning needs. She's a stay-at-home mom with 3 kids, and she's in the Pasadena area. And the topic is sensory integration. What is it? How does it impact behavior, emotional regulation, and development? So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This is a huge topic. I do like 12-hour seminars on this, so we're going to do our best to get through what we can, and just know that this is the tip of the iceberg, and hopefully this will spark some more curiosity and answer some of your questions as well. So first, we are going to look at what are sensory processing and sensory processing differences. So when we think about sensory integration, it's actually how all of these sensory systems, how all of our 8 sensory systems are working together in order to help us achieve a task or an outcome. Our sensations do not occur in isolation, and everything that we do requires a lot of integration of all of our sensations. So I'm sure you're familiar with the 5 sensations that you learn in school, and still kids are learning 5 senses. And every time I see that, I'm like, no, there's 8. So your tactile, sense of touch, your visual, auditory, olfactory, which is smell, and gustatory, which is taste. But we actually have 3 other sensory systems as well. Our proprioceptive sense is our sense of awareness in space. It's how our muscles and joints relay information about our body position. Our vestibular system is the receptor is in your middle ear, and there's fluid that moves with your movement, head movement, body movement, to tell you where you are in space and how you are in relationship to gravity. And then we have our interoceptive awareness, which is the awareness of our internal organs and sensations and our emotions. And all of these sensations, all sensory integration is all rooted in our relationships with people around us and also our internal regulation. So further on in the presentation, we're going to talk a lot about the dynamic interaction between relationship, sensory processing, and regulation, because they're so highly related. Our vestibular, proprioceptive, and tactile systems are considered the big 3 sensory systems, particularly in sensory integration therapy, because they are thought to be the ones that drive the majority of how we interact with our bodies and our environment and other people around us. I will also say the way in which we process sensory information is very much related to our genetics. They found a lot of genetic connections. It's related to our environment, and our exposure to different sensory inputs just on a regular basis. So this complicated picture is basically meant to show you how many areas of the brain are implicated in sensory processing, that it really is a whole brain integration. And when the sensory input comes in through the sensory receptors, it's relayed to the thalamus and other places in the limbic system. And then it's from the thalamus relayed to other areas of the brain in the cortex. Okay. So sometimes it's easier to talk about a disorder or a difference in order to really fully understand the topic that you're talking about. So when we think about sensory processing in general, but also sensory processing differences, you can think about it in these three categories as sensory modulation, sensory-based motor, and sensory discrimination. And we're going to go through each of these three categories and tease apart what the differences are and how it might affect people differently. But in general, under sensory modulation, when you think of sensory over-responsivity, or now the preferred term is hyper sensitivity or hyper-responsivity. Oftentimes children who are gifted or have anxiety are over-responsive, or over-responsiveness is a comorbidity with those. Dyspraxia, oftentimes poor handwriting, difficulty using scissors, difficulty tying shoes, like all those motor-based things are often associated with dyspraxia. Postural disorder, difficulty sitting in a chair without support, sitting up, often like a floppy body. Tactile discrimination, oftentimes kids will have a really unique pencil grasp because they're not understanding where they need to put their fingers on the pencil in order to move them efficiently. And interoceptive discrimination, often difficulty with toilet training, difficulty with emotional awareness. They might confuse emotions with other physiological needs, or physiological needs with emotions. So they might feel like they're hungry when they're actually anxious because they're feeling that like nervousness feeling in their stomach, and they can't differentiate what those two things are. The research on sensory processing differences is pretty old. So in a meta-analysis in 2009, an estimated 5 to 16% of the population was shown to have sensory processing differences. I would imagine that number is quite larger than what it was in 2009. It is more prevalent in boys than girls. And children with sensory processing differences have a higher sympathetic response, meaning they're going into their fight or flight response more easily and for longer periods of time than children without sensory processing differences, which makes sense because they're on high alert within their bodies, within their environment, when interacting with other people, because they don't know necessarily what to expect. They can't trust their bodies. They can't trust the environment because the response is sometimes evokes a fear-based response, but sometimes it's just really inconsistent and they don't understand, well, how come I can do it this time and not that time? And it's also, I think parents have have a hard time with that too. Because they're like, wait a minute. Speaking of kids with dyspraxia, wait a minute, you put on your pants the other day and now today you're telling me you can't do it, or you're showing me that you can't do it. I don't understand. But when the conditions are perfect or set up for success, then usually they can rise to that occasion. And we'll talk about that a little bit more. Oh, and sensory under responsiveness can also be a comorbidity with depression. Basically, you're just not taking in, or you're not receiving in your brain the intensity of the signal, and so you're basically not sensing things in your environment in the way that other people are. So things can feel a lot duller and more mundane. So it's harder to like engage in the world because you need something so amped up. Okay, so when we think about sensory modulation disorder, this is really the category of sensory processing that is related to our detection of threat and our detection of safety. So this is really what is associated a lot with our regulation. Our sympathetic nervous system will alert the prefrontal cortex to attend and orient to the stimulus. We have to be alerted to what's happening in the room to respond to it or within our bodies. And then our sympathetic nervous system can affect our mood in the amygdala and limbic system. So there's an emotional response. So we can have a protective response and an emotional response to that alerting sensation that's coming into us, which can be really functional and can be highly productive. If you hear dog barking, you're going to want to turn to it and see, like, is that dog on a leash? Is that dog big or small? Do I need to be worried about this dog? But then what needs to happen after you're alerted to that dog and you're curious about your safety, the parasympathetic nervous system is then activated, and the amygdala is calmed when the stimulus is non-threatening. So you turn, you see the dog, you're like, okay, it's on a leash, it's small, I don't have to worry, like my life's not in danger. Your parasympathetic kicks in and you can go on with your day. And it may happen that the dog barks again and you don't have to turn every time that dog is barking because you've habituated to it and your brain is like, no, this is not a threat, it's okay. You can keep talking, engaging in your conversation or reading your book or whatever you're doing. For kids and adults who have difficulty with sensory modulation, particularly in this instance with auditory modulation, they are going to hear that dog barking and their parasympathetic nervous system is not going to kick in. So their sympathetic is going to remain elevated. They're going to remain in a more fearful stance. Like, okay, I see that dog is on a leash. I see it's a smaller dog, but still I am in this elevated state. And they're going to habituate less in terms of frequency. So when that dog barks again, they're going to be on high alert again and again. And it's going to be hard for them to keep engaging in the task in the environment because they're still feeling on high alert. When is that going to happen again? When is that noise going to sound again? So habituation is important because it allows us to discard unimportant or non-novel information so that we can continue to focus on the task. We're not paying attention to the lights in the room constantly because our brain is saying, okay, that's not important right now. It's not a threat. We can just keep focusing on what we need to. Stress prevents the prefrontal cortex from effectively habituating. So kids with sensory modulation differences often experience a high level of stress in their environment because they are on edge about what they're gonna anticipate. Is somebody gonna touch me unexpectedly from behind, or am I gonna touch something unexpectedly? Am I gonna go outside and the wind is gonna blow on my skin, and that's really averse to me? Am I gonna smell something when I walk into a room that is really dysregulating? So there's this stress that happens within the situation itself, and there's also a stress of anticipating what could possibly happen if I go into the situation that's unfamiliar. Could I possibly encounter a smell or a touch or a sound that puts me into this fight or flight state? So it can be quite debilitating. Sensory discrimination is kind of the next level of sensory processing. Sensory modulation really sets the stage for discrimination. We have to attend to the input and understand that it's present in order for us to then discriminate it. We also need to be able to modulate the input and say, this isn't a threat, this is safe, and I can engage with it before we can discriminate it, because we don't care about the details of something if something feels like a threat to us. We just want to get away from it and protect ourselves from it. So it's pretty common for the three branches of sensory processing differences to overlap. It's very common for kids to have both sensory modulation and sensory discrimination difficulties, or sensory discrimination and praxis difficulties. So they do overlap quite a bit because one informs the other. So discrimination helps us with differentiation and with meaning. So differentiating the temporal aspects of an input, like the timing of it. When is it happening? How fast is it happening? Our spatial awareness of where is that input happening, the intensity, how much input, and duration, how long. So a pretty easy example to think of is a spider crawling on your arm, and you can think of like, this is tactile discrimination. You can think temporally, like, how fast is that spider moving on my arm? You can think spatially, where on my arm is that? How intensely is that spider moving on me, which might be an indicator of what type of spider it is and how big it is, and how long has it been on my body for. So you're really cueing into some of the finer details, the finer aspects of what that object is, which helps us then to create associations and inferences. It helps us to generalize information about objects and about environments, so that when we approach them, every time we know what to expect. I put in one of these books an example of one time I was in the pantry and I reached into a bag full of potatoes to grab out a potato, and you think, okay, this potato is going to be hard. It might be a little rough. It might have some bumps on it from like eyes that are starting to grow on it. I reached in and I just grabbed mush, and I was like, it just pulled back because I was anticipating from my past experience that this was going to be what it felt like. Like, these are the finer details of that potato when I reach in, and it did not match my previous experiences, and it totally threw me off, and my sympathetic nervous system definitely kicked in for a little bit. So discrimination, it's like fine-tuning your sensory inputs, which is also true not just of like touch and sight and hearing. So a lot of discrimination with sight is like visual based tasks, visual discrimination, visual spatial abilities, sounds, hearing the difference between sounds, difference between languages, but also movement and timing your movements correctly and doing the correct intensity of movement, that when you're shooting a basketball from this far from the hoop, it's going to look a lot different than from the other room or from 2 feet away from the hoop. Can you adjust your body appropriately? So the final category is sensory-based motor abilities. And again, the 2 categories are praxis and postural stability. Praxis is really our ability to coordinate movements efficiently. The different components of praxis are ideation, so coming up with an idea for a movement. And some kids can struggle with all of these categories and some with just a few of them. So coming up with a plan, which is why praxis really sets the foundation for executive function skills. When you think about sequencing and planning and organizing, you do that first with your movement as an infant and a toddler. So you're coming up with a plan for something. Then you have to plan, you have to motor plan. Okay, how am I going to carry out this plan? Put a sequence together for how you're going to carry that out. Then you have to actually execute that motorically and move your body through that. Problem solve. Oh, I thought this was going to work, but it's not. So how can I quickly adjust it? Or, whoop, that didn't work. Let's see if I do it this way next time, which is also reflecting on that. And that often happens really quickly. It's not like you're sitting down after everything you do. I mean, like, how could I do that differently? You're just kind of adjusting in the moment as you're moving through those motor-based tasks. Praxis is really important for building confidence and competence in movements. Oftentimes kids with dyspraxia will do things really quickly because you can compensate. If you're moving really fast, you don't have to actually do the movement very well. You can just make it seem like you're doing the movement. So having kids slow down is often a really good indicator of their praxis skills. But also, in order to do things efficiently throughout the day and carry on your day effectively, you have to rely on the ability to generalize your motor skills and do them in a way that you don't have to focus all of your time and all of your attention, your brain power on, okay, when I step into my pants, I need to put them here. I need to balance on one foot. Now I need to lift my leg up this high and put it back down. Like, it's just a lot of brain power. But kids with dyspraxia, that's often what they experience. It is a lot of brain power to get through really simple tasks, what we consider simple tasks and routine tasks. And then postural stability, which probably should go first because it actually informs praxis a lot. But we have a saying in occupational therapy that proximal stability equals distal mobility. So your ability to stay stable in your core, your tummy muscles, your back muscles, informs your ability to move your limbs and to stay in a stable position, shift your equilibrium when you need to. So when you think about sitting in a chair and reaching for something and your ability to shift your position and not fall out of a chair and then come back up to an upright position. It's really hard to move your hands and feet if you feel unstable in your core. So there's a lot of like this type of kids who are like moving around a lot because their core stability is so poor that they're not able to just stay in a stable position. So we're going to do a couple examples, one for sensory discrimination and one for praxis. So can I have one volunteer come up and do an activity related to sensory discrimination?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm going to have you put on this glove, and this is going to symbolize a child who has difficulty with tactile discrimination. So basically differentiating their finger movements and how they need to hold a pencil. So if you think about how many times in a classroom a teacher says, okay, I want you to grab and like reach into your backpack or reach into your pencil case, and I want you to take out a pen or a pencil or a marker. So for a child, so this is going to symbolize backpack, pencil case. For a child who has difficulty with sensory discrimination, that's going to be a lot more challenging when you can't rely on your visual cues because you can't readily discriminate the difference between the different things. So I would like you to pull out nice. Good job. There you go. Kind of a guess. Okay, and I'm gonna have you with this pen, if you could write on this paper, Institute for Educational Advancement. All right. So I would like you to reflect a little on the experience of both pulling the pen out of the box and also writing on the notepad.
Yeah, it just took a lot more intention and focus.
Sure.
And that took a lot more just, single-minded.
Right.
You know.
Yeah, you had to filter out what was happening. Yeah. Thank you.
Can you show what it says on?
Oh, sure. This is an penmanship class.
It probably was harder to write small as well.
Oh yeah, I mean, I just.
So the next thing we're gonna look at is praxis. So if I could have another volunteer. So I'm gonna have you come up here. I want you to tie the shoelace. I'm just gonna hold one end while you tie the other. I want you to tie it with your eyes closed, the way that you normally tie your shoelaces.
Okay.
Do you normally tie it the bunny ears way or the around the tree way?
Around the tree.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And while you're doing that with your eyes closed, I would like you to tell me what you did earlier today.
Earlier today, I went to a park with my kids and I picked up their friend first and then we went to the park.
Great. Okay, now I want you to try to tie this with your eyes closed, doing the bunny ear method. Do you know that one where you make the two loops?
Yeah.
Okay.
That I'm not practiced. Okay.
Exactly. Exactly. That's the point.
And you want me to tell a story or?
If you could tell us something that you did over the holiday weekend.
Over this holiday weekend, my family went to Descanso Gardens and we went every day last weekend because we loved it so much. We kept leaving late, so we would leave at like 3:40 and it closed at 5. So we're there for about the last hour on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday.
Great. So now could you reflect on your experience doing the different ways and having to talk about what you did while you were doing it?
Yeah. Yeah, the first one I could focus more on the story and just kind of tie, and the next one, there was a point I remember kind of pausing and like, oh, what do I do now? And then keep trying. Oh yeah, keep telling the story. There's a kind of a pause.
Yeah, so similarly, a lot more intention and having to like think about what you're doing more, which takes a lot more cognitive effort. So
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
So in terms of praxis, really learning from your past experiences and being able to generalize what you do is really important in your everyday life. You tend to do things the same way every day because it helps you move through your day more efficiently, and doing things differently every day would be really challenging. So, this is a quote that I really appreciate. The appropriateness and meaningfulness of any response reflects to a great extent how well our nervous system processes sensory input it receives. So the question is, what does it mean when this doesn't happen? And we went into that a little bit with the sensory modulation, sensory discrimination, and sensory-based motor differences. But often it means that we exhibit signs of sensory distress because we aren't responding to that sensory input in an appropriate and meaningful way, and it's causing our nervous system to go in a fight, flight, or freeze state. So I'm not going to read through this list, but you can take some time to read through some of these signs of sensory distress. Oftentimes, these distress signals are ways to control the environment. It's a cry for co-regulation. I need somebody else here present with me. I need to borrow somebody else's nervous system regulation because I'm showing that this whatever's happening in my environment isn't working for me. And pushing through the task is not going to be helpful. Have you guys seen any of these sensory distress signals? Yeah.
One for
Okay. So these are essentially a stress response from your nervous system. Your vagal tone is increased. And it's saying, get me out of here. So specific to IEA, sensory differences in giftedness. To be honest, there's not a whole lot of research out there on sensory processing and giftedness. There's not a whole lot of research on sensory processing differences in general, because funding is so low and because a lot of people still don't believe that it's a real diagnosis, which is why it's still not in the DSM. So from these sources, in 2003 and 2007, there's an estimated comorbidity of 17 to 35%, which is considerably higher than the 5 to 16% that we talked about before. A lot of the understanding around why that is kind of conjecture at this point. There's not really a whole lot of solid research as to like the neurobiology behind it, behind why children with giftedness would have sensory processing differences. Lou and colleagues did a little bit of research on it and found that children with giftedness often take in more sensory information, just like they're taking in more information in general. So it just causes a whole lot of overload, which is why over responsivity to auditory input and tactile input. I was reading olfactory input is also a pretty common over responsiveness in children with giftedness. They also, I have found in my personal practice that children with giftedness often have difficulty with praxis. And I think a lot of that's related to the asynchronous development that happens in giftedness, that praxis is such a whole body integrated experience that it can be really challenging because their brains are not integrating in the same way that other more typically developing kids are. And sometimes that catches up as their brains, as the development becomes less asynchronous as they get older, there's more brain integration and more synchronicity. But sometimes not. And I would say oftentimes not, in my experience. The limbic system is also so highly involved in sensory processing integration, which we saw with the thalamus, the amygdala, the hippocampus is really involved as well. So it's very common for kids with giftedness who have more intense limbic systems, or their limbic systems are being activated more readily, that they are also experiencing this over responsiveness to sensory input because their brain is already being like, whoa, this is really intense. I think this is more of a threat than a safety. And then handling the emotional response that comes with that more intense input is often amplified as well. And again, sometimes that can be mitigated with more synchronous development and more brain integration as they get older, but not always. And I think kids with giftedness, in my experience, are often a lot better at masking their sensory processing differences up till a point. Oftentimes increased demands and just age helps to kind of close that ability to mask, but they can hide their difficulties because logically they can work through the problem pretty well, or control their environment pretty well. So this is the trio that we're going to spend a lot of time on: regulation, relationship, and sensory processing. So this is kind of the foundation of just understanding behavior in general. And we talk a lot about this in our books. But really, when we look at behavior, we have to look at a child's regulation, because regulation is driving behavior, and behavior is then going to inform regulation. So when you think about a child becoming dysregulated for some reason, you see that through their behavior. It's a behavioral output to an internal dysregulation. And then the behavior that they're doing is often an attempt to get back to a regulated state. Many times it's not functional or effective, but that's what they're attempting to do, is to get back to a regulated state. And all of that is happening within the relationships in that particular room at that particular time. So that's the reason behind the title of our book, The Why Behind Classroom Behaviors, because we really want to ask, why is a child behaving a certain way? What is driving that dysregulation? And for kids with sensory processing differences, it's the sensory environment around them or internally. There's a mismatch. And so we have to ask why and what's going on. And these are all the other things that could also drive dysregulation as well. Not getting enough sleep, not eating enough, having too much screen time, learning differences, social emotional differences, difficulty with attachment, or just a mismatch in the environment. A lot of what we know about regulation now is really rooted in polyvagal theory. Dr. Stephen Porges's work, and he has created this map of our vagal response, and our vagus nerve is really responsible for activating our parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Our vagus nerve is also connected to our heart, our lungs, our digestive system. So when you have this change in vagal tone, you are also experiencing that in your heart rate and in your breathing and in your digestive system, because it's all connected in your emotional responsiveness. So our ventral vagal state is considered our green zone. It's when we're in this calm, alert state. And our sympathetic nervous system gets activated when we have a fight or flight response, when we get overstimulated or overwhelmed or are just feeling like pretty amped up. Our heart rate goes up, our muscles tense, our breathing becomes more rapid. We're not interested in eating at all. We just want to get out of that situation and do what we need to. And then the dorsal vagal response is like an amplified parasympathetic response, where essentially we've used all of our resources from our sympathetic nervous system and we just don't have anything left to give. And so you just shut down, you freeze. And it's a more intense response than our sympathetic response. Often if you still have a fight in you, there's like, you're more readily able to get back to your green zone. But if you're just like, I don't even care. Like, I do this with my kids sometimes. I'm like, no, you can't stop eating away from the table. You need to sit down. And then all of a sudden I'm just like, I don't even care. I don't have any more fight left in me. Like, I just want to curl up in a ball right now. Like, I can't. And so with kids with sensory processing differences, they live in their sympathetic nervous system so much. It's their home away from home. They often live like such on the edge of ventral vagal and sympathetic, or ventral vagal and dorsal vagal, because they've experienced so much sympathetic for so many years that they're just like, all right, I'm not even going to try anymore. I don't have anything left to give, essentially. So I'm shutting down here. These vagal responses can also you can basically like expand your vagal response. So your green zone can, which we call our window of tolerance, can grow or shrink depending on your past experience or what's happening in the moment. So kids with sensory processing differences oftentimes have very small green zones. So they very easily toggle between their green zone and their their red zone. They don't stay in their green zone very often because their window of tolerance is so low. And through sensory integration therapy and other tools, which I'll talk about another tool in a little bit, you can expand that green zone, expand their window of tolerance. So as they're moving through that emotion, they're not toggling so quickly. They can move through that same up and down line and maybe still stay in their green zone or dip a little bit into their red zone. But if they're right here, they're going to dip a lot more easily into the sympathetic. There's also something, as you're going from ventral vagal to sympathetic, there's something called the vagal brake, which basically is your ability to say, like, oh, I'm about to enter sympathetic, or like my sympathetic is starting to kick in, but I need to get back to ventral vagal. So you kind of pump that brake, your vagus nerves pumps the brake. Okay, I can get back to my green zone. Like, oh my gosh, I don't know where I am. I'm so lost right now. What am I going to do? Oh my gosh, this is really not good. I don't have any directions. My phone died. And you're just like, what do I, like, okay, I'm just going to pull over. And then you kind of take a breath and you're like, okay, this is what I need to find a gas station and then I can go. And so your vagal brake kind of pumps and helps you to not fly totally off the cuff. Kids with sensory processing differences and with emotional dysregulation in general have a very hard time pumping that vagal brake. So it's very easy for them to just 0 to 60 fly off the cuff because they're not pumping that brake to make them be like, okay, whew, I don't have to go there. I can reel it in and come back.
Do you know much about what that is like biologically? The brake?
It's part of the vagus nerve, just being able to, like the parasympathetic nervous system, basically being able to like not activate the sympathetic nervous system as much, essentially.
Somehow like cuts off that nerve.
Yeah. Well, you're not cutting off the nerve, you're cutting off the response from the sympathetic system. So it's not as amplified. Yeah. So just to mention about regulation, that it's adaptive. It doesn't always imply a calm, alert state. It matches the task. So when you're regulated going to bed, you're more in your dorsal vagal state. When you're regulated because you're so excited about a birthday party, your sympathetic nervous system is going to kick in more. So your regulation is going to match the task. And when it's not matching the task, that's when you have to say, there's consistently a mismatch here. It's dependent on the need for safety. Always go back to safety and your sense of safety within your body and within the environment, within your relationship. It serves as a means of communication, which we talked about, and it always starts with co-regulation. Co-regulation leads to self-regulation. And I think a lot in our society, we start with self-regulation and then say, okay, now you can co-regulate, which is essentially the idea of a timeout, right? Like, okay, go by yourself, regulate yourself, and then you can come back to me and then I'll be there for you. Rather than saying, okay, let's join together, let's calm down together. You can borrow my nervous system. My calm is meeting your storm. okay, now we can solve the problem together, or now that you're calm, you can even solve the problem on your own, and self-regulate through the rest of the problem. This is from our book, and this can be parent response, not just teacher response, but essentially, a student or a child's regulation is going to drive their response, which we talked about, regulation driving behavior, but also the response of the parent or teacher, or the regulation of the parent or teacher is going to drive that parent or teacher's response, which is then going to inform the child's regulation and response. So our ability to stay regulated and to stay calm in a system or in a situation is going to help drive the child's regulation as well. So matching their regulation is not always the best idea. You're not going to stop a child shouting by shouting at them. So meeting them with a calmer regulation is going to help to change their regulation and therefore their behavior. So when we think about pyramid of engagement, when we think about learning and engaging in school, we have emotional regulation, sensory processing, and just our involuntary functions, being alive, as things lower down on the pyramid that need to be integrated before learning can happen. So it's really important to address sensory processing because it drives emotional regulation, which ultimately is going to impact engagement in learning. So just a reminder as to why all of these are important. I'm going to skip this picture for the sake of time. So when we think about people with sensory processing differences, we all have sensory preferences. We all have senses that we gravitate towards and that tend to be more regulating and calming, and senses that we tend to say, okay, that's overstimulating to us, and or senses that we're like, yeah, I don't even really notice that like really impacts my regulation or engagement. Kids with sensory processing differences, this is even more true, and it's a really helpful way to start investigating what could be happening in the environment and in their bodies that's driving some of that dysregulation. So you can think about which sensory experiences cause you or your child to become more regulated, which sensory experiences cause you to become less regulated, and thinking about how can I integrate some more of those sensory experiences that drive my regulation throughout the day, so that I'm kind of getting relief from sensory overstimulation. And then which sensory experience, the less regulated sensory experiences, you try to take those out as much as possible throughout the day. And I know it sounds pretty common sense, but it's a really, really great way to start. If my child is becoming really dysregulated with noises, then maybe I vacuum while he's at school instead of at home. So thinking about ways that you can change the environment to help support your child. And then how do these responses, how does your response from sensory input change when you have other stressors present? When you haven't slept well, when you haven't eaten well, when you have a deadline at work, when you're moving, all of those factors are going to change how you respond to sensory experiences. So things that wouldn't necessarily cause you to be dysregulated, when there are other stressors added on top of it, it might cause you to be actually really dysregulated. So thinking about your child and how stressors might also drive some of their sensory dysregulation is really important. So these are some typical self-regulation sensory strategies. Some of them are more effective, more functional than others. But all of these strategies are essentially a way of your body trying to get back to a state of regulation by using sensation, and trying to lean into some of these strategies is often a really effective way to start, because your body is already trying to do some of this stuff to get you back to a state of regulation. Well, these are some pictures. So these are some of the sensory strategies that are often used with kids with sensory processing differences, particularly in school. So getting outside is such a great way to foster our sensory engagement and our integration of all of our sensory systems. It creates this balance of having like a calm, alert state of being in nature, and also challenging our movements and challenging our problem solving and ability to just integrate everything that's going on around us. In this book, Balanced and Barefoot, which I highly recommend, she recommends that toddlers spend 5 to 8 hours outside, children 4 to 5, and teens 3 to 4 hours outside, which I know sounds like a crazy amount of time, especially given the amount of structured activities that kids participate in these days. But really being able to get outside and be in unstructured environments, engaging with the world, is hugely beneficial to the integration of our sensory systems, and learning from those experiences and being able to problem solve and engage with other kids as well.
The recommendation is per day, right?
Is what?
Per day.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah. Getting in the kitchen is another way that I really recommend for helping with sensory integration. There's just so many different activities in the kitchen that involve all of our senses, and can really foster not only sensory modulation, but discrimination and praxis as well. And finally, getting to work, putting your kids to work and doing chores is another amazing way to naturally foster sensory integration development and just whole brain integration as well. So I'm currently not seeing clients because I am at home full time with my 3 kids. But I am doing this Safe and Sound protocol, which is a therapeutic tool that is used in conjunction with other therapies, occupational therapy, mental health therapy, play therapy. And it's a therapeutic auditory program based on, whoops, why did that not show up? There should be a graphic here, but I don't see it. So it's an auditory program that's based on that polyvagal theory, which we went over earlier, which really focuses on the hierarchy of the vagus nerve, which is the ventral vagal, sympathetic, and dorsal vagal. Neuroception, which is your sense of safety and your need for co-regulation. And it's a regulation-based program. Is for nervous system regulation, particularly for kids who experience frequent dysregulation, which is kids with sensory processing differences, kids with difficulty with co-regulation, usually kids with sensory processing differences, auditory sensitivity, which is a sensory processing difference, social engagement difficulties, which can be a challenge for kids with sensory processing differences, because they might not feel like they can engage with peers at the same level or at the same speed, particularly kids with dyspraxia, and also kids who have sleep challenges, which sometimes can be kids with sensory processing differences. So this tool is a 5-hour program where they listen to music that is specifically filtered to go through all of the ranges of frequencies. And the reason that it's an auditory program is because Dr. Porges found that middle frequencies are calming to the vagus nerve and help to keep you in your ventral vagal state, in your green zone. And frequencies that are low and high can often trigger a response in the sympathetic or dorsal vagal, particularly for kids and adults who struggle with some of these things. And that's because low frequencies like the humming of a refrigerator or computer or like all those background noises can often be overstimulating, and human voice is a higher frequency, which can also be overstimulating, which is why it's good for kids with social engagement difficulties, because sometimes engaging with the human voice just feels threatening to their nervous system. And so I've seen just amazing results for both kids and adults through the Safe and Sound protocol in helping to regulate their nervous system better so that they can then participate better in therapy or participate better in daily life functions, kind of get them over the hump of just dysregulation all the time. And parents just see amazing differences across the board in terms of sleep and language production and ability to communicate their emotional needs, ability to use some of the tools that were given in therapy. So I throw that out there because I think it's a really amazing tool, and one that is progressively being used more and more. And I also just helped write the guidelines for the Safe and Sound protocol in conjunction with the sensory integration approach. So that's coming out in a couple of weeks. It's going to be published. So I would say check out that as a resource if you feel like your child could benefit from like basically a baseline stabilization of their nervous system regulation. And the diagram that is missing is a pie chart that is the 3 components of the Safe and Sound protocol. So there's the Safe and Sound Connect, which is essentially priming for participation in the Safe and Sound protocol for people who have really sensitive auditory systems who might not be able to tolerate wearing the headphones or listening to the range of frequencies. The core program is that 5-hour listening program that is over the course of 10 days, usually 10 to 12 days. And then there's a balance program that is basically a maintenance program that helps to support the progress that was made during the core program. That's done more like on a need to need basis for that child. So these last couple slides one is on sleep and one is on diet, because sleep and diet really also drive a lot of regulation, and particularly kids with sensory processing differences. They tend to be a lot more sensitive when there is a change in their sleep schedule. They can also have difficulty maintaining a sleep schedule and falling asleep. And again, it goes back to nervous system regulation, because in order to be able to fall asleep and stay asleep, your nervous system has to be in a regulated state, and essentially in a down-regulated state, which can be challenging. So this is just giving you the duration of sleep that is recommended for kids of certain ages. I will also say I have seen some kids who have had such severe sleep deprivation that it looks like they have sensory processing differences, but actually it's just all related to sleep, because they're so dysregulated and they can't focus, and things are louder and brighter and faster when you haven't slept and haven't had good sleep. So maintaining good sleep is a really important thing, and things that I recommend for healthy sleep: no screens, 2 hours before bedtime or even after dark. The blue of the screen can mimic the sun and can actually play tricks with the chemicals in your brain, melatonin in particular. Exposure to sunlight in the morning, so waking up and getting in sync with the circadian, or the sunrise and sunset, your circadian rhythm, getting in sync with that is really important. Doing physical activity an hour and a half to 2 hours before bedtime, so that you do have time to then calm down after the activity and come down from it. A nighttime snack an hour before bedtime, so that you have time to digest it and your digestive system is not releasing enzymes and chemicals that are causing you to stay awake. And then using sensory input or removing sensory input in the room, thinking about things, again, going back to the sensory profile of things that are regulating or not regulating, and try to put more regulating things into the bedroom and taking away some of the less regulating things. And this is to show you that the brain and the gut are really, really highly connected. 90% of our serotonin is actually released in our gut, not in our brain, because there's just such high communication between the two. And our emotions drive what is happening in our gut because of our vagus nerve, and what is happening in our gut is then communicated back to our brain. So making sure that kids are eating healthy and eating regularly, particularly kids who are gifted. I found that a snack during and or after a really intense cognitive activity is really important, because their glucose levels are often drained because of the high cognitive function. And so making sure they have access to snacks throughout the day can be a lot more important for kids who are gifted, because they need that replenishment a lot more frequently. And stress can manifest in a lot of different ways from the gut. And I think research is starting to show that a lot of the complaints that people have physiologically are oftentimes related to the gut and what the gut is doing or not doing. These are some websites that I recommend you checking out. SPD STAR gives a lot of really great background on sensory processing and sensory processing differences. They're kind of like the premier research people in the sensory world. They're located in Denver. And then sensoryprocessingdisorder.com and A Sensory Life are more tools for things that you can think about and ways that you can further understand each of the sensory systems, like a breakdown of each sensory system and how it all relates to sensory modulation and discrimination. And then integratedlistening.com is where you'll find information on the Safe and Sound protocol. And my email and where you can find us on Instagram.
Great, thank you, Jamie. And then I know we'll stop recording, and if anyone wants to ask questions, I know we have quite a few people online, but feel free to ask any questions.